The Arizona desert stretched out like a sea of red sand and stubborn brush, broken only by the jagged peaks that clawed at the endless sky. In 1882, this was still wild country, where a person could ride for days without seeing another soul. Most folks thought you had to be half crazy to make your home out here, especially if you were a woman alone. But Clara Bennett wasn't most folks. Her little cabin sat tucked into a fold of land where the desert started climbing toward the pine forests. It wasn't much to look at, just rough-hewn logs chinked with mud and moss, a stone chimney that sometimes smoked more than it should, and windows made from real glass that had cost her 3 months of careful saving. But it was hers, every nail and board of it. Clara had built this life with her own 2 hands after her husband died of the fever 2 winters back. Thomas had been a good man, gentle and steady, but he'd never quite understood her fierce love for this harsh country. When the sickness took him, her brother back in Kansas had written letter after letter, begging her to come home, to live with his family where it was safe and proper. She'd burned every one of those letters in her fireplace. The truth was, Clara had found something out here in the wilderness that she'd never had back east. Freedom. Real freedom, not the kind they talked about in Sunday sermons or political speeches. Out here, she could wake up when the sun touched her face, work as hard or as gentle as the day demanded, and answer to nobody but herself and the Almighty. Her days followed a rhythm as old as the land itself. Before dawn, she'd be up checking her chickens. 12 good layers that somehow managed to thrive despite the coyotes and the occasional mountain lion. The hen house was built like a fort, with thick walls and a roof that nothing could tear through. Those eggs were worth their weight in silver to the miners down in Copper Creek, a rough settlement about 8 miles south through the canyon. After the chickens came the garden, her pride and joy. Most people said nothing would grow in this rocky soil, but Clara had proved them wrong. She'd hauled rich dirt from the creek bottom, built careful terraces to catch every drop of precious rainwater, and coaxed life from the stubborn earth. Tomatoes grew fat and red in the summer heat. Beans climbed toward the sky on poles made from dead pine branches. Corn stood in neat rows, their leaves rustling secrets to the wind. The real money came from washing. Every Tuesday and Friday, Clara would ride her old mare Buttercup down to Copper Creek, with her big wash tub tied behind the saddle. The miners paid well to have their clothes properly cleaned, not just dunked in the creek and beaten against rocks, but really washed with soap and care. Their shirts might be stiff with sweat and dirt, their pants torn and stained with the red earth, but Clara could make them look almost new again. She'd learned to read men's stories in their clothes. The careful miner who tried to make his things last, the reckless one who went through shirts like they were paper, the homesick boy who kept a letter in his pocket until the paper fell apart, the old-timer whose hands shook too badly to sew on his own buttons. These miners were her neighbors, though the closest one lived a good 5 miles away. They were rough men, most of them, worn down by the desert and the dangerous work underground, but they treated Clara with respect. Word had gotten around that she could handle herself, that she was a crack shot with her husband's Winchester, and had once faced down a black bear that was getting too friendly with her chickens. The Apache were different. They passed through her valley sometimes, usually heading north toward the high country or south to trade with the Mexican settlements. Clara had learned to spot the signs: horses' hoof prints in the soft earth near the creek, bent branches that marked a trail, sometimes smoke rising from their carefully hidden camps in the hills. The other settlers feared them. Stories traveled fast in this empty country, tales of raids and kidnappings of settlers who'd vanished without a trace. The folks down in Copper Creek talked about the Apache like they were ghosts or demons, something to whisper about when the sun went down, but Clara had never been one for gossip or fear-mongering. The few times she'd actually seen Apache warriors, they'd been passing through like shadows, interested in their own business, not hers. They moved through the land like they were part of it, reading signs in the rocks and sky that she was only beginning to understand. Sometimes she'd find small gifts left near her water trough. Smooth stones, a handful of pine nuts, once a beautiful feather from a red-tailed hawk. She never saw who left them, but she had her suspicions. It was the Apache way, she'd heard, to leave something in return when they used another person's water. The isolation never bothered her. After growing up in a house full of brothers and sisters, where you couldn't think a private thought without someone interrupting, the silence of the desert felt like a blessing. She could spend hours working in her garden, listening to the wind sing through the pine branches and the distant cry of eagles soaring over the peaks. Her evenings were her own. She'd sit on her little porch as the sun painted the sky in shades of orange and purple, watching the stars come out one by one. The desert came alive at night with sounds most folks never heard: the soft pad of fox paws on stone, the rustle of owls hunting, the far-off howl of coyotes singing to the moon. She'd taught herself to read the weather in the shape of clouds and the direction of the wind. When storms were coming, the air would smell different, sharp and electric. The animals knew too. Her chickens would huddle close to the coop, and Buttercup would stamp her hooves and look toward the mountains with worried eyes. Winter was the hardest time. Snow could close the passes for weeks, cutting her off from Copper Creek and the outside world. She'd learned to prepare like her life depended on it, and it did. Dried beans and corn filled pottery jars. Smoked meat hung from the cabin rafters. Firewood was stacked higher than her head against the north wall. But even winter had its beauty. On clear mornings, the world would sparkle like it was made of diamonds. Her breath would make clouds in the crisp air as she broke the ice on the water trough and scattered grain for the chickens. The silence was different then, deeper and more complete, broken only by the crack of settling timber and the whisper of wind through bare branches. Clara had made peace with the loneliness. She wrote letters to her brother's family, though she sent them rarely. She kept a journal, recording the small events that marked her days. The first tomato of the season, a family of deer drinking from her creek, the day she saw a golden eagle circling high overhead. These moments felt important, worth remembering, even if she was the only one who would ever read about them. She'd created her own traditions too. Every Sunday she'd put on her best dress and read from her mother's old Bible on the porch, making her own church service under the open sky. She figured God could hear her just as well out here as in any fancy building with stained glass windows. The local store owner in Copper Creek, an old German fellow named Heinrich, had become something like a friend. He'd save newspapers for her when the supply wagons came through, and they'd sit on his porch sharing coffee and catching up on news from the outside world. Heinrich understood what it meant to make a life in hard country. He'd come west after his wife died, looking for a place where his grief could heal in peace. But Clara's closest companion was Buttercup, her steady old mare. The horse had been Thomas's before she was Clara's, and she seemed to understand the weight of that history. Buttercup was smart and sure-footed, picking her way through rocky trails that would challenge a mountain goat. She could sense trouble before Clara could see it, her ears pricking forward and her muscles tensing when danger was near. As autumn painted the high country in gold and red, Clara felt the familiar rhythm of preparation setting in. Winter would be here soon, and she needed to be ready. Her root cellar was already well stocked, but there were still things to do. Final repairs to the roof, checking the chimney for bird nests, making sure her supply of lamp oil would last through the long, dark months. She had no way of knowing that this autumn would be different from all the others. No way of knowing that before the first snow fell, her quiet life would be turned upside down by an encounter that would change everything she thought she knew about courage, kindness, and the invisible threads that connect all living things. The desert kept its secrets as it always had. But some secrets Clara would soon learn were meant to be discovered. The October afternoon hung heavy with the kind of stillness that makes your skin prickle. Clara had been hanging her washing on the line behind the cabin, humming an old hymn her mother used to sing, when something made her stop mid-note. The desert had gone too quiet. No bird songs, no rustle of small creatures in the brush. Even the ever-present buzz of insects had died away. Buttercup lifted her head from grazing near the fence, her ears swiveling toward the hills like compass, needles seeking true north. The mare's nostrils flared, catching a scent that Clara couldn't detect. Something was coming. Then she heard it. A sound that made her blood run cold. It wasn't the high, yipping calls of coyotes that she knew so well. This was deeper, more menacing. Wolf song, wild and hungry, echoing off the canyon walls like a promise of death. Clara dropped the wet shirt she'd been hanging and shaded her eyes with her hand, scanning the slopes above her cabin. The pine trees stood dark against the brilliant blue sky, their shadows creating a maze of light and darkness, where anything could hide. At first she saw nothing but the familiar landscape that had been her world for 2 years. Then movement caught her eye, something small and desperate, stumbling down the rocky hillside about half a mile away. At this distance it looked like a wounded animal, but as Clara squinted harder, her heart stopped. It was a child. The wolves appeared like gray ghosts materializing from the shadows between the trees. 5 of them, moving with the deadly grace of creatures bred for hunting. They flowed down the slope like water, closing the distance between themselves and their prey with terrifying efficiency. The child, and Clara could see now it was definitely a child, probably 8 or 9 years old, was trying to run, but one leg wasn't working right. Clara's mind went blank for a moment, overwhelmed by the impossibility of what she was seeing. Wolves were rare in this part of Arizona, driven higher into the mountains by settlers and hunters. What were they doing down here in the foothills? And what was a child doing alone in the wilderness, so far from any settlement? The questions lasted only seconds before training took over. Thomas had spent months teaching her to shoot, making her practice until she could hit a tin can at 50 yards. "Never know when you might need to defend yourself out here," he'd always said. Clara had thought he was being overcautious. Now she blessed his memory. She ran for the cabin, her skirts tangling around her legs. The Winchester hung over the fireplace, where it always had, loaded and ready. Her hands shook as she grabbed it, but her movements were sure. Thomas had drilled into her the importance of gun safety until it was second nature. Back outside, the scene had gotten worse. The child had stumbled and fallen, rolling behind a boulder that provided only partial cover. The wolves had slowed their approach, spreading out in a semicircle the way pack hunters do when they know their prey has nowhere to go. They were beautiful animals, Clara thought distantly, silver and gray and black, built like living weapons. But beauty meant nothing when that weapon was aimed at a helpless child. Clara raised the rifle and fired into the air. The crack of the gunshot echoed through the valley like thunder. The wolves scattered, startled by the unexpected noise, but they didn't go far. They melted back into the tree line, yellow eyes gleaming as they watched and waited. "Run!" Clara shouted at the child, though she wasn't sure if her voice would carry that far. "Run to me." The child lifted his head. She could see now that it was a boy, and for a moment their eyes met across the distance. Even from half a mile away she could see his terror and exhaustion, but she could also see something else. Determination. This boy wasn't going to give up. He struggled to his feet, favoring his injured leg, and began a stumbling run toward her cabin. Clara kept the rifle trained on the tree line, ready to shoot again if the wolves came back. But they were smarter than that. They knew about guns now, knew about the danger that came from the two-legged creatures. They would wait and watch and look for another chance. The boy was moving faster now, driven by hope and desperation. As he got closer, Clara could make out more details. His skin was dark, burned by sun and wind. His long black hair streamed behind him as he ran. He was wearing buckskins, not the store-bought kind that white settlers sometimes wore, but the real thing, soft and well-made, and decorated with beadwork. Apache. The realization hit Clara like a physical blow. This was an Apache boy, alone and injured and running for his life. Every story she'd ever heard about her white neighbors being killed by Indians flashed through her mind. Every warning about the savage nature of the Apache people. Every reason she should turn away, close her door, pretend she hadn't seen anything. But all she could see was a child in mortal danger. The boy reached her fence line and collapsed against the wooden posts, gasping for breath. Up close, Clara could see the full extent of his injuries. His back was marked with long scratches, claw marks from where the wolves had gotten too close. His left ankle was swollen and already turning purple. Dried blood matted his hair where he'd hit his head on something during his flight. "Easy," Clara said softly, the way she would to a frightened animal. "You're safe now." The boy looked up at her with eyes that held too much knowledge for someone so young. He said something in Apache, his voice barely above a whisper. Clara couldn't understand the words, but she didn't need to. Universal human desperation needed no translation. She looked back toward the hills where the wolves had disappeared. They were still there, she knew. Wolves were patient hunters. They could wait for hours, even days, for the right moment to strike. And this boy was in no condition to run anymore. "Come on," Clara said, gesturing toward her cabin. Inside. The boy tried to stand, but his injured leg buckled. Without thinking, Clara slung the rifle over her shoulder and put her arm around his thin shoulders, helping him to his feet. He was lighter than she'd expected, all bone and lean muscle. When had he last eaten a proper meal? Together they made their way slowly toward the cabin. The boy leaned heavily on Clara, his breathing harsh and labored. Every few steps he would glance back over his shoulder, watching for gray shapes in the shadows. The wolves were out there somewhere, and they both knew it. Clara's mind was racing as she helped the boy up the steps to her porch. What was she doing? Taking in an Apache child could get her killed, if not by his own people, then by her white neighbors who would see her actions as treason. The territorial government had been fighting a bitter war against the Apache tribes for years. Trust between the two peoples was almost non-existent, but as she looked down at the boy's exhausted face, none of that seemed to matter. He was hurt and scared and far from home. She was the only thing standing between him and the wolves. The choice wasn't really a choice at all. Inside the cabin, Clara helped the boy to the chair beside her fireplace. He slumped forward, his head in his hands, shoulders shaking with exhaustion and relief. Clara fetched her medical supplies, the same kit she used when Buttercup got cuts or when she injured herself working around the homestead. "Let me see that ankle," she said gently, kneeling beside the chair. The boy looked at her warily but allowed her to examine his injury. It was badly sprained but not broken. She'd seen enough injuries on the frontier to know the difference. The claw marks on his back were shallow but would need cleaning to prevent infection. As Clara worked, cleaning wounds and applying salve, the boy watched her with curious eyes. She found herself talking to him, even though she knew he couldn't understand her words. Sometimes the sound of a human voice was medicine all by itself. "You've had quite an adventure, haven't you?" she said, carefully wrapping his ankle with clean cloth. "Those wolves gave you a real scare." "Gave me one too, if I'm being honest." The boy said something in Apache, his voice stronger now. Clara looked up to see him pointing at the rifle leaning against the wall, then at her, then toward the hills. His meaning was clear. "Thank you for the rescue." "You're welcome," Clara said simply. Outside, the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of gold and red. Soon it would be dark, and darkness belonged to the hunters. Clara got up and checked the locks on her door and shutters, precautions she'd never needed before but was grateful for now. The wolves might be gone for the moment, but she had a feeling this was far from over. She heated soup on the stove, simple broth with vegetables from her garden. The boy accepted the bowl gratefully, drinking it down like he hadn't eaten in days, which Clara realized he probably hadn't. As the night deepened around her little cabin, Clara found herself in a situation she'd never imagined. She was sharing her home with an Apache child, with wolves prowling somewhere in the darkness outside and no idea what the morning would bring. She should have been terrified. Instead, watching the boy's eyelids grow heavy as warmth and food worked their magic, she felt something she hadn't experienced since Thomas died. She felt needed. For the first time in 2 years, she wasn't alone in her little cabin at the edge of the world. The first thing Clara noticed when she woke was the fever. She'd dozed in her chair by the fireplace, the Winchester across her lap. But sometime during the night, the boy had started burning up. His forehead was hot as a stone left in summer sun, and he was mumbling words in Apache that sounded like pleas or prayers. Clara had nursed Thomas through his final fever, so she knew the signs. The boy's body was fighting hard, against infection from the wolf scratches, against exhaustion, against whatever had driven him so far from his people in the first place. But fever was dangerous. especially in someone so young and already weakened. She moved quickly, building up the fire and setting water to heat. Cool cloths for his forehead, willow bark tea for the fever, clean bandages for his wounds. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, but inside she was fighting her own battle against worry. She'd saved him from the wolves, but that might not matter if she couldn't break this fever. The boy's eyes opened as she pressed a damp cloth to his burning skin. For a moment he looked around wildly, not recognizing where he was. Then his gaze found Clara's face, and some of the panic left his expression. He said something in Apache, his voice cracked and dry. "Shh," Clara whispered, the way she would, to comfort a sick animal. "You're safe. Rest now." She spooned water between his cracked lips, a few drops at a time. He was too weak to sit up properly, so she had to be careful he didn't choke. His breathing was shallow and too fast, like a bird's, heart beating in her palm. Outside, the night was alive with sounds that made Clara's skin crawl. Wolves howling in the distance, their voices rising and falling like some ancient song of hunger. They were still out there, still waiting. The scent of their intended prey was probably driving them crazy with frustration. Clara checked her rifle again and made sure the cabin was secure. The door was barred, the shutters latched tight. Her little fortress would hold against wolves, but she couldn't help thinking about what would happen when morning came. This boy belonged to someone, somewhere. His people would be looking for him, and when they found him in the home of a white woman, she pushed those thoughts away. Right now, the only thing that mattered was keeping him alive through the night. The fever got worse before it got better. Around midnight, the boy started shaking so hard that Clara could hear his teeth chattering. She piled every blanket she owned on top of him, but still he shivered. Then just as suddenly, the shaking would stop and his skin would burn so hot she worried his brain might cook inside his skull. Clara had dealt with fevers before, but never one this severe. She made willow bark tea and managed to get some down his throat. She bathed his face and arms with cool water from her well. She talked to him constantly, even though she knew he couldn't understand her words. Sometimes she'd heard the sound of a human voice could call a wandering spirit back from the edge of darkness. "My name is Clara," she told him as she changed the cloth on his forehead. "I live here alone, except for my horse Buttercup and my chickens. Not much of a family, but they're good company most days." The boy's eyes would focus on her face sometimes, as if he was trying to understand. Once, he reached out with a trembling hand and touched her wrist. His fingers were burning, hot, but the gesture was gentle, almost grateful. "I had a husband once," Clara continued, her voice soft in the fire-lit cabin. "Thomas. He was a good man, patient and kind. He taught me to shoot, taught me to read the weather, taught me how to make this place a home. I think he would have liked you. He always said children were blessings no matter where they came from." Around 2 in the morning, the wolves came back. Clara heard them first as a rustling in the brush around her cabin, then as low growls that seemed to come from everywhere at once. They were testing her defenses, looking for a way inside. One of them scratched at her door, long claws scraping against the wood. Another tried the shutters, pushing against them with its weight. Clara sat perfectly still, rifle ready, hardly daring to breathe. The boy was too weak to understand the danger, but some instinct made him press closer to her. Sighed. "Easy," she whispered, as much to herself as to him. "They can't get in. We're safe." But her heart was hammering against her ribs. These weren't ordinary wolves, driven by simple hunger. There was something almost personal in their persistence, as if they'd been cheated of a kill and wouldn't give up until they got what they'd been promised. The siege lasted an hour. The wolves circled her cabin like gray ghosts, testing every possible entrance. Once Clara saw yellow eyes peering through a crack in the shutters. Another time, she heard claws on her roof, scratching at the wooden shingles. But the cabin held, and eventually the pack melted back into the darkness. When dawn finally began to paint the eastern sky pink and gold, Clara felt like she'd fought a battle. Her back ached from sitting upright all night. Her eyes burned with exhaustion and her hands shook from holding the rifle for so long. But the boy's fever had broken. She noticed it when she pressed her palm to his forehead and felt blessed coolness instead of burning heat. His breathing had deepened and steadied. The terrible tension in his small body had relaxed into real sleep instead of the restless tossing of sickness. Clara closed her eyes and said a prayer of thanksgiving. She wasn't particularly religious. Living alone in the desert had given her a complicated relationship with God, but some moments demanded acknowledgement of forces beyond human control. As the sun climbed higher, filling her cabin with golden light, the boy stirred. His eyes opened slowly, and for the first time since she'd found him, they were clear and focused. He looked around the cabin with obvious curiosity, taking in the rough furniture, the colorful quilts, the shelves lined with books and supplies. Then his gaze settled on Clara, and she saw recognition there. He remembered her. He remembered being saved. The boy tried to sit up, winced as his injured ankle reminded him of its presence, then settled back against the pillows. He said something in Apache, and though Clara couldn't understand the words, his tone was unmistakably grateful. "You're welcome," she said, smiling for what felt like the first time in days. He pointed to himself and said what sounded like key. Then he pointed at Clara with questioning eyebrows raised. "Clara," she said, touching her own chest. "My name is Clara." "Claire, he repeated, the syllables strange in his mouth but recognizable. It was a start. Clara heated more soup and was amazed to see him eat with real appetite. Color was returning to his cheeks, and though he was obviously still weak, there was alertness in his movements that had been missing during his fevered night. She examined his wounds in the morning light, and was relieved to see no signs of infection. The wolf scratches were healing cleanly, and while his ankle was still swollen, he could move his toes without too much pain. He would recover fully, given time and rest. But time was something Clara wasn't sure they had. Key belonged somewhere, to someone. His family would be frantic with worry, searching every canyon and valley, and when they found him here in the home of a white woman, she tried not to think about what that might mean. Apache warriors had good reason to distrust white settlers. Too many promises broken, too many treaties ignored, too many families destroyed by the long, bitter war between their peoples. What would they think when they found their child in her care? Key seemed to sense her worry. He pointed toward the mountains, then to himself, then made a gesture that clearly meant many people. His family wasn't just a mother and father. He belonged to a whole band, maybe a whole tribe. They would come looking for him, and they would come in force. "How far?" Clara asked, pointing in the same direction. Key held up his hands, showing fingers in what looked like numbers. Then he pointed to the sun and moved his hand across the sky. Days. His people were days away, maybe a week of hard travel through difficult country. But they would come. Clara was as sure of that as she was of her own name. No Apache family would abandon a child to the wilderness. They would search until they found him, or until they found his body, which meant Clara had a choice to make, and not much time to make it. She could try to take Key back to his people herself, though she had no idea how to find them, and the journey would be incredibly dangerous for both of them. She could take him to the authorities in Copper Creek, though she wasn't sure what they would do with an Apache child, and she was certain it wouldn't be anything good. Or she could keep him here, care for him until he was strong enough to travel, and hope that when his people came looking, they would understand that she had acted out of mercy, not malice. Looking at Key's young face, still pale from his ordeal but alive and alert, Clara knew she'd already made her decision. She would do what felt right. Consequences be damned. She would care for this child until he could be safely returned to his family, and she would trust that love and kindness spoke a language that crossed all boundaries. The wolves were gone, with the daylight, but Clara knew they would return. And soon other hunters would be tracking through her valley. Human hunters looking for a lost boy. When they came, she would be ready. 3 days passed like pages turning in a book Clara had never read before. She'd lived alone for 2 years, grown comfortable with silence and solitude, but sharing her small cabin with Key was teaching her things about herself she'd never known. The language barrier should have made everything impossible, but somehow it didn't. Humans, Clara discovered, could communicate an amazing amount without words. A smile meant the same thing in any language. A gentle touch spoke of comfort and safety. Shared laughter at Buttercup's habit of stealing apples needed no translation. Key was a quick healer and an eager student. By the second day, he was hobbling around the cabin on a crutch Clara had fashioned from a sturdy pine branch. His ankle was still tender, but the swelling had gone down considerably. The wolf scratches on his back were scabbing over cleanly with no signs of infection. What impressed Clara most was his natural grace. Even injured, even in an unfamiliar place, Key moved with the fluid efficiency of someone raised in harmony with the natural world. He wasted no motion, made no unnecessary noise. When he sat, it was with perfect balance. When he stood, it was like watching water find its own level. On the morning of the second day, Clara was surprised to find him already awake when she stirred from sleep. He was sitting by the window. The shutter cracked just enough to let him observe the world outside. His dark eyes tracked every movement, a bird landing on the fence post, a squirrel gathering nuts, Buttercup grazing in the early morning light. "You're watching for them, aren't you?" Clara said softly. "Your people." Key looked at her and nodded, understanding her tone if not her words. He pointed toward the mountains and made a gesture that clearly meant, "Coming." Then he held up 3 fingers and moved his hand across the sky. 3 days, maybe 4 at the most. Clara felt her stomach tighten with nervousness. She'd known this moment would come, but that didn't make it any easier. What would she say when Apache warriors appeared at her door? How do you explain kindness across a divide carved by years of war and mistrust? But watching Key's face as he scanned the horizon, Clara saw something that gave her hope. There was no fear in his expression, only anticipation. He wasn't worried about what his people would do when they found him with a white woman. He trusted them to understand, just as he had learned to trust her. That trust had grown day by day, built on small acts of kindness and patience. Clara had shown him how to milk her 2 goats, laughing when the first stream of warm milk had splashed on his moccasins. He had shown her a bird call that could summon blue jays from the pine trees, his face lighting up with delight when she tried to imitate the whistle. They developed their own language of gestures and expressions. Key would point to objects and Clara would tell him the English words. Bucket. Chicken. Fire. He would repeat them carefully, his accent making the familiar words sound exotic and musical. In return, he taught her Apache words that felt strange and beautiful on her tongue. "Shash," he said, pointing at Buttercup. "Bear." Clara laughed and shook her head. "Horse," she corrected. "Buttercup is a horse, not a bear." But Key grinned and repeated "shash" with obvious amusement. Maybe Buttercup reminded him of a bear with her stocky build and shaggy winter coat. Or maybe it was an Apache joke, the kind of teasing that transcends language barriers. Their daily routines began to mesh like gears in a well-made clock. Clara would rise before dawn to tend the chickens and check on Buttercup. Key, despite his injury, would insist on helping with small tasks, gathering eggs, carrying water, stirring the pot while Clara prepared their simple meals. He couldn't do heavy work, but he contributed what he could with the dignity of someone who had been raised to pull his own weight. In the afternoons, when the desert heat made outdoor work impossible, they would sit in the shade of Clara's little porch. She would mend clothes or work on her knitting while Key carved small figures from pieces of pine wood, using a knife Clara had given him after deciding she could trust him with a blade. His hands moved with practiced skill, creating tiny animals and birds with just a few careful cuts. It was during one of these quiet afternoon sessions that Clara began to understand more about Key's story. Using gestures and simple drawings scratched in the dirt, he showed her what had happened. He had been with a hunting party, older boys and young men learning the skills they would need as adults. They had been tracking deer in the high country when something spooked the animals. "A bear," Key indicated, making clawing motions and growling softly. "A big one, dangerous and territorial." The hunting party had scattered, planning to regroup at a predetermined meeting place. But Key had gotten turned around in the thick forest, and by the time he found the meeting spot, his companions were gone. He had tried to track them, but rain had washed away their trail. Alone and increasingly desperate, he had been making his way toward the main camp when the wolves found him. The rest, Clara knew. The desperate flight down the mountainside, the rescue, the fever-haunted night when his life had hung in the balance. What struck Clara most about his story was what wasn't in it. No blame, no anger at the companions who had left him behind. In Key's telling, it was simply something that had happened, like a sudden storm or a flash flood. The natural world was dangerous, and sometimes people got separated from their families. What mattered was survival and finding your way home. On the third day, Key surprised Clara by helping her in the garden. His ankle was much stronger, and he moved between the rows of vegetables with careful attention, pulling weeds and checking for insects that might damage the plants. He seemed fascinated by her orderly rows and irrigation channels, so different from the wild plants he was accustomed to. When he found a tomato worm on one of her plants, he didn't kill it immediately. Instead, he called Clara over and pointed it out, asking with gestures what she wanted him to do. When she nodded for him to remove it, he did so gently, carrying the green caterpillar to the edge of the garden where it could find other food without damaging her crops. It was a small thing, but it told Clara volumes about the boy's character. He understood the balance between human needs and the natural world. He could be practical when necessary, but never cruel. That evening, as they sat by the fire sharing their usual dinner of cornbread and vegetable stew, Key did something unexpected. He reached into his shirt and pulled out a small leather pouch that had been hanging around his neck. Clara hadn't even noticed it before. It was so much a part of him that it had been invisible to her eyes. With ceremonial care, Key opened the pouch and removed a handful of small objects. A piece of turquoise, smooth and blue as a summer sky. A perfectly round pebble from some sacred stream. A feather from a red-tailed hawk. Other things Clara couldn't identify but could tell were precious to him. He selected the hawk feather and held it out to Clara with both hands, speaking softly in Apache. His meaning was clear. This was a gift, something of value he wanted her to have. Clara was moved almost to tears. She understood the significance of what he was offering. These weren't just random objects. They were his medicine bundle, the sacred items that connected him to his spiritual world. For him to share even one piece with her was a gesture of trust and friendship that crossed every boundary between their peoples. She accepted the feather with the same ceremonial care he had shown in offering it. It was beautiful, russet red with darker bands and perfectly preserved. She held it up to catch the firelight, and the colors seemed to glow from within. "Thank you," she said softly. "It's beautiful." Key smiled and nodded, satisfied that she understood the importance of his gift. Then he pointed at Clara and then at the feather, making a protective gesture. She was under the hawk's protection now, part of the spiritual network that connected all living things. Clara got up and went to her trunk, where she kept her few precious possessions. From beneath her mother's Bible and her wedding dress, she pulled out a small silver locket that had belonged to her grandmother. It was simple but elegant, engraved with tiny flowers. She brought it back to Key and opened it, showing him the miniature portrait inside, her grandmother as a young woman, painted in soft watercolors. Key studied the picture with fascination, understanding that he was seeing someone important to Clara's family history. With the same ceremony he had shown, Clara fastened the chain around Key's neck. The silver locket settled next to his medicine pouch, two different traditions of keeping precious things close to the heart. They sat in comfortable silence after that, each wearing something that belonged to the other's world. Clara found herself thinking about the invisible threads that connected all people, regardless of the color of their skin or the language they spoke. Kindness was kindness. Courage was courage. Love was love. Outside, the desert night was alive with its usual symphony. Coyotes calling in the distance, the soft hoot of an owl, the rustle of small creatures going about their business. But there was something different in the air tonight. A sense of expectation that made both Clara and Key glance frequently toward the windows. Tomorrow, or perhaps the day after, Key's people would come. Clara could feel it in her bones, the way she could feel approaching storms or changes in the weather. The time of waiting was almost over. As she banked the fire for the night and checked the locks on her doors, Clara found herself thinking about Clara woke before dawn to the sound of horses, but not the familiar clip-clop of shod hooves on hard ground. These were unshod ponies, moving like whispers across the desert floor, their steps so soft they might have been the wind stirring dry leaves. She lay perfectly still in her bed, every sense alert, counting the rhythm of hoofbeats. Many horses, many riders. They had come. Beside the dying embers of the fireplace, Key stirred and sat up. Even in the pre-dawn darkness, Clara could see the change in his posture. His head was tilted, listening to sounds she could barely detect. Then his face broke into a smile brighter than sunrise, and she knew these weren't strangers approaching her cabin. These were his people. Clara reached for the Winchester more from habit than fear, but Key's gentle hand on her wrist stopped her. He shook his head and pointed toward the window, his expression peaceful and excited. Whatever was happening outside, he wasn't afraid of it. Together, they moved to the shuttered window. Clara opened it just a crack, enough to peer out into the gray world before dawn. What she saw made her breath catch in her throat. They had surrounded her cabin without a sound, Apache warriors, women, children, and elders, materializing from the desert like spirits taking human form. Clara counted at least 30 people, maybe more, all mounted on small, sturdy ponies that stood as still as statues. They weren't positioned like an attacking force. There were no weapons visible, no aggressive postures. Instead, they sat their horses with the patient dignity of people who understood the importance of ceremony. But what truly amazed Clara was what they had brought with them. Even in the dim light, she could see that her fence posts were draped with beautiful blankets, geometric patterns in red and black and white that seemed to glow against the weathered wood. Pottery vessels sat along her garden path, each one carefully placed and obviously valuable. Baskets woven from pine needles and decorated with intricate patterns lined her porch steps. The air was filled with the soft scent of sage and sweetgrass. They hadn't come as enemies. They had come bearing gifts. An elderly man rode forward from the group, and Clara knew immediately that he was someone of importance. He sat his horse with the natural authority of a leader, but there was kindness in his weathered face and wisdom in his dark eyes. His long gray hair was braided with feathers and beads, and he wore a shirt decorated with intricate beadwork that must have taken months to complete. This had to be Key's grandfather, Clara realized. The resemblance was clear in the shape of their eyes and the proud way they both held their heads. The old man dismounted with fluid grace and approached Clara's cabin. He walked slowly, giving her time to understand that he came in peace. When he was still 20 feet from her door, he stopped and spoke in Apache, his voice carrying clearly in the still morning air. Key moved away from the window and toward the door, his face radiant with joy. Clara followed, her heart hammering, with nervousness and anticipation. She had no idea what Apache customs governed a situation like this. Was she supposed to open her door? Wait for permission? Offer food and water? Key made the decision for her. He unbarred the door and opened it wide, stepping out onto the porch with Clara beside him. The morning air was cool and sweet, touched with the promise of the rising sun. The old man's face transformed when he saw Key. For a moment, the dignified leader became simply a grandfather who had found his lost grandson. He opened his arms, and Key ran to him as fast as his healing ankle would allow. The embrace that followed needed no words. Relief, love, gratitude, and joy all expressed in the way they held each other. When they finally separated, the old man kept his hands on Key's shoulders, studying his face and obvious good health with the careful eye of someone who had feared the worst. Key spoke rapidly in Apache, gesturing toward Clara in the cabin, clearly telling the story of his rescue and recovery. The old man listened intently, his gaze moving between his grandson and the white woman who had saved him. When Key finished speaking, the elder nodded slowly and turned to face Clara directly. He placed his right hand over his heart and bowed his head, a gesture that needed no translation. Gratitude, respect, recognition of a debt that could never be fully repaid. Clara felt tears prick her eyes. She had been so worried about this moment, so afraid that misunderstanding and prejudice would turn kindness into tragedy. But looking into the old man's face, she saw only wisdom and appreciation for what she had done. "He's a good boy," Clara said softly, knowing the elder wouldn't understand her words but hoping he might understand her tone. "Brave and kind. You should be proud of him." The old man smiled, and Clara could see where Key had gotten his quick intelligence and gentle "Arr." The elder spoke again, this time addressing not just Clara but the entire group that had come with him. His voice carried across the desert air with the authority of someone accustomed to being heard and obeyed. What happened next took Clara's breath away. One by one, members of the Apache band began to dismount and approach her cabin, each carrying gifts. They moved in a kind of ceremony, silent and respectful, placing their offerings with careful precision. A middle-aged woman approached with a basket so finely woven it seemed to be made of silk instead of grass. The pattern depicted running horses, their forms captured in geometric perfection. She set it gently on Clara's porch and bowed her head before retreating. A young warrior brought a pair of moccasins made from the softest doeskin Clara had ever seen. The beadwork was exquisite, tiny flowers and vines that seemed to dance in the growing light. He placed them beside the basket and stepped back with quiet dignity. An elderly woman hobbled forward with a clay pot that radiated warmth. When she lifted the lid, the smell of honey and pine nuts filled the air. Food for the woman who had fed their lost child when he was hungry. The gifts kept coming. A knife with a handle carved from deer antler, a necklace of turquoise and silver that caught the first rays of the rising sun, bundles of sage and sweetgrass for blessing and purification, a small drum painted with symbols that Clara didn't recognize but somehow understood were meant to bring protection and good fortune. Each gift was presented with ceremony, as if Clara were a visiting dignitary instead of a simple frontier woman who had done what anyone with a heart would do. The Apache people weren't just thanking her for saving one child. They were honoring her as someone who had proven that kindness could bridge any divide. Key stood beside his grandfather, watching the gift-giving with obvious pride. Occasionally, he would point to Clara and speak in Apache, and she heard her name, Clara, repeated with what sounded like affection and respect. When the last gift had been placed, the elder approached Clara again. This time he carried something in his weathered hands, a small piece of carved wood that gleamed like polished stone. As he got closer, Clara could see that it was a tiny horse, perfect in every detail from its flowing mane to its delicate hooves. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, the kind of work that took not just skill but true artistry. The old man placed the carving in Clara's hands with the same ceremony he might use to crown a chief. He spoke in Apache, his voice formal and dignified, and though Clara couldn't understand the words, she could hear the weight of tradition behind them. Key stepped forward and translated, speaking slowly in his careful English. "Grandfather says, you have heart of the people. You see, child in need, not enemy. You—" He struggled for the words, then touched his chest and gestured toward Clara. "You sister now, sister to the people." Clara felt tears running down her cheeks. In all her imaginings about this moment, she had never dreamed of anything like this. She had expected fear, maybe anger, certainly suspicion. Instead, she was being welcomed into a family that stretched across tribal boundaries and racial divisions. The sun was fully up now, painting the desert in shades of gold and red. The Apache band began to mount their horses again, their ceremony complete. But there was no urgency in their movements, no sense that they were fleeing or escaping. They were simply people who had accomplished what they came to do and were ready to return home. Key approached Clara one last time. Around his neck, her grandmother's silver locket caught the morning light. In his hands, he carried the hawk feather she had treasured for 3 days. "For you," he said in English, holding out the feather. "Always remember, Clara knelt down to his level and took the feather, but then she did something that surprised even herself. She reached out and hugged him, the way she might hug a nephew or a neighbor's child. For just a moment he was stiff with surprise, then his thin arms wrapped around her neck and hugged her back with fierce affection. "I'll never forget you," Clara whispered against his hair. "Never." When they separated, Key was smiling through tears of his own. He spoke rapidly in Apache to his grandfather, who listened and nodded gravely. Then the old man approached Clara, one more time. He took her hand in both of his and spoke a few words in Apache. Then, in careful accented English, he said, "You. Welcome. Always welcome. Our lodges. Your lodges. Our fire. Your fire." Clara understood. She was being offered something more precious than all the gifts surrounding her cabin. She was being offered belonging. If she ever